Okay, y'all, so I've been studying up on the history of the Brazilian dictatorship amongst some other Latin American tyrant stuff that I think is really relevant right now. And I've been studying up on it so I can distill some of it for you. So there's a very interesting thing about the Brazilian dictatorship, which is the middle class of their military class. Okay, so in Brazil, you have all of these rich white Portuguese descendant landowners. Brazil is one of the few modernized countries that has never had significant land reform. So those people still own huge colonial amounts of land, right? And then you basically have your black and brown unlettered masses, which really in Brazil was kept illiterate for a very long time. Brazil still doesn't have like a huge reading culture. Anyway, you have and then the people at the top, right? The few white people at the top holding the power are always afraid of the masses, right? And Brazil is a country at least kind of similar in size to the United States. Brazil is about 211 million people. We have about 360 million. Okay, you can't control that many people by force. Nobody can, right? So you have to have this barrier class, okay? And in Brazil, they built that up with a military political class. And ultimately, that military political class was like, you know what? You all aren't better at ruling the country just of how you were born. We're going to take over. One significant thing I want to say, the United States doesn't have a military political class. We used to, but ever since the Civil War, we do not allow that, right? That's part of why we change the military around all the time. I'm a former Army captain. If you don't know, I know what I'm talking about, okay? We geographically use our soldiers, officers every 2 to 3 years, enlisted every 4 to 6 years, but often more, by moving them around the country and even the world. And that is, in fact, so that you don't have the development of an officer political class. And so that, and we don't allow active duty officers to be in politics. Okay, so you only get that from like the reserves or the National Guard. We don't have this political class, military class in America that's going to step up and take over. Okay, so one other interesting parallel that I want to make though is I've also been reading from the People's History of the United States, and I just made a separate video about this, but saying that in America, this is what the revolutionary founding fathers did. They were the very wealthy landowners, and they allowed the rise of a middle class by giving some land to a bunch of white farmers so that they would have a barrier in between them in power and the unlettered masses, right? Which today, obviously, we're going to call just people living on the poverty line. And so as soon as the middle class decides to stop being the barrier for the upper class, there's a lot of power. There's a lot of power in the middle class, and there's a lot of power in huge amounts of people in the lower classes. And I hate to talk about the United States like this, but we need to. We have a crazy class system, and understanding that the middle class is going to have to get angry enough to respond to the upper classes who are in political power. Hopefully this helps. I'm trying to have this professor of Brazilian history, Dr. Brian Pitts, on. In the meantime, if you're interested in hearing more about this, there's a podcast that he was on. And if you just go to Spotify and do Brian with a Y Pitts, Brazil, you can hear this until the storm passes. And it's very interesting because he talks a lot about the resistance from just people just continuing to be self-serving and doing their own thing and fighting back kind of at local levels, which is ultimately what destroyed the military dictatorship in Brazil.